Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military of a Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the northern directions where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And before we start talking about the Sumy direction, first of all I would like to discuss with you this video that was published by the Russians. And in this video we can see how the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover positions of the armored forces of Ukraine where they installed their communication equipment. Most likely those communication equipment that Ukrainians used both to support their drones deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation and probably to attack Russian drones that were attacking, for example, during the previous several days. The most interesting part of this video is that the Russians, when they discovered these positions and this equipment, first attacked this territory with Iskander missile, and it was very precise strike, and then the Russians attacked the same area with several ground drones. So the most important that the Russians are able to attack the same point, the same target with several types of missiles and drones at the same time. So most likely this equipment was completely destroyed. Now let's move further, let's discuss the situation in the Sumy direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to stabilize the situation around the settlement of Tetkina. The roads supplying the Russian garrison in the territory of the settlement of Tetkina have been unblocked after the arrival of reinforcements from the northeast. Ukrainian forces were pushed away from the highway after a series of Russian counterattacks. So according to information we have, during the previous days the Russians managed to introduce additional forces on the territory of the village by the name of Tetkina and Popovo-Ležachi, and that forced the Ukrainians to fall back from this area. So most likely the situation in the area of the settlement of Tetkina was stabilized completely. The Ukrainians were forced to fall back for regrouping. Now it's very interesting to understand what exactly the Ukrainians are going to do next, because obviously the Russians don't need to keep lots of forces, huge contingent on the territory of the settlement. Most likely the Russians after several days would be forced to move this contingent back, let's say, in the direction of the city of Sumy. Maybe then the Ukrainians will resume their attempts to attack in this area. Now let's talk about the Sumy offensive itself, about the original direction. According to information we have, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the settlements of Khotin, the settlements of Mala Karchakovka. So the Russians, as you can see, began bombing and attacking, basically reducing till ruins the second defense layer, without any attempts as for now to attack these territories. Most likely the Russians will begin their offensive operation in the direction of the second layer after the Russians finish the battle completely for the central and for the eastern directions. When talking about the central and the eastern directions, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special. We got just one adjustment on map that was published by neutral mappers. The Russians during the previous night, during the previous 12 hours, managed to secure these three lines to the west of the settlement of Kharkif. So nothing special, just additional small progress on the ground without significant changes. As several pro-Russian resources this morning reported that the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense to the east of the settlement of Kharkif and to get as close as possible to the settlement of Sadki. So summarizing everything, according to several pro-Russian resources, by the morning of the 11th of June of 2025, the Russians established complete control over everything along this red line. Obviously, if this information is correct, then most likely the Russians have already established complete fire control over the one of the most important tree lines that goes between the settlement of Kharkif and, let's say, the mainland, this huge Sumy forest. So the battle for Kharkif obviously will take several days more, but obviously we are entering the final phase of the battle for the first defense layer of the Sumy direction. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kharkiv and in the Kupiansk direction. When talking about changes on the ground, we haven't received anything special along the entire line of the river Oskol, but we got very important updates to the west of the river Oskol in the Kupiansk region. According to information we have, the Ukrainians announced additional evacuation. The forced evacuation zone has been expanded in the Kharkiv region, the regional administration. We are talking about the settlements of the Kupiansk district, Baranovka, Berezovka, Berezovka, Novonikolaevka, Spadobovka, Stara Igorovka, Duvanka, and Fyodorovka, the report says. So according to information we have, during the previous days, the Ukrainians decided to evacuate additional zones to the west of the river Oskol, and we are talking about these villages that are located along this line. So this is very important because this evacuation reveals us some plans of the Russian forces, and now we understand that most likely the Russians are going to continue their outflanking maneuver to the north and the northwest of the city of Kupiansk, not just from the northern directions, but most likely, according to this evacuation zone, we should expect additional or another offensive operation from the Russian side in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Sinkova. Most likely the Russians are planning to cross the river Oskol in this area as well, with the purpose to begin encirclement of the city of Kupiansk from the south and from the southwest. So that is why the Ukrainians evacuated this zone, with the purpose to concentrate additional forces in this area, with the purpose to stabilize the situation and not to allow the Russians to finish these flanking maneuvers. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kostiantynivka direction. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very important updates and changes on map. First, let's talk about the city of Chasiv Yar. According to information we have, the Russians managed to secure additional 3 lines in the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal to the west of the settlement of Grigorovka, so additional territories this morning were colored in Russian favor as a contested area, not in the Russian favor. We don't have proofs of this. And when talking about the southern directions, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly. First of all, let's talk about the situation along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. Several pro-Russian mappers have colored this pocket completely in Russian favor, but when talking about geolocations, we have just this video where we can see how Russians were storming another tree line in this area, and this episode was geolocated. This episode took place exactly in this area, and the Russian soldier was securing exactly this tree line. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map along this tree line and the territories below. So this is the situation, for example, by the end of the 10th of June of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 11th. So telling the truth, we have no doubts that most likely the Russians either have already probably secured this pocket or about to finish this, and we believe that during the next 24, 48 or 72 hours we will color these territories. So everything to the east of these red lines, so we're talking about this pocket, would be colored in the Russian favor in a very, very near future, because the Russians most likely managed to break Ukrainian defense in this area, and currently the Ukrainians are forced to fall back. Furthermore, we expect that probably this upcoming day or the upcoming 24-48 hours would be decisive for the Ukrainians. They would abandon their positions with the purpose to avoid encirclement. Very interesting details are coming from the Kiban pocket. Today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the north of the city of Pakovskration, to the north of the city of Toretsk, by taking under control additional positions. So we have another video where we can see how Russians were attacking this stronghold. And according to geolocation that we managed to find during the video we've just seen, the Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory, and the Russians continue advancing. And currently, if we calculate the distances, the distance between Russian positions and the railways is already around 1 kilometer, and the distance between possible edge Russian positions and the next road is already around 1.79 kilometers, and the distance between Russian positions and the Kiban water reservoir itself is already 2.2 kilometers, which is already nothing for the Russian FPV drones. But obviously the Russians are not going to stop, as we discussed in the previous videos. First of all, the Russians will try to secure the mine to the south of these recently gained Russian positions. Then the Russians would try to establish complete control over the next company stronghold to the west of this area. And then the Russians most likely will try to establish complete control over the tree lines along the railways. So obviously this is the maximum plan of the Russian Federation. If they are able to take these positions, this is going to be already already complete control over this territory without any chances for the Ukrainians from the settlements of Novospaska, Shcherbinovka, Katerinovka and Kiban Big for evacuation. Once again, from this very moment, when the Russians take under control this tree line, the Ukrainians will not be able to use this road for evacuation, rotation, supply and support, because the Russians most likely will establish complete fire control over this territory. And then the Ukrainians will have just one road of evacuation to the west of the Kliban-Bytska water reservoir. But as we discussed in the previous videos, currently the Ukrainians have huge problems in this area, because currently the Russians are advancing from at least three directions. The Russians are attacking from the south in the direction of Alexander Kalinova. The Russians are trying to advance in the fields between Yablunovka and Alexander Kalinova village, and the Russians are attacking from the western part of Yablunovka in the eastern direction. So in the very near future, we expect that defense of these villages would collapse and the Russians would take these territories under complete control. Furthermore, today we have this video that was published by Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how Russians were attacking these trenches. In this video we can see how Russian soldiers under very heavy mortar fire were moving through the trenches with the purpose to secure them and to establish complete control over this territory. Right exactly in this video we can see Russian soldiers that were moving along this, let's say, stronghold. These are Russian soldiers right now in front of your screens. So this episode was geolocated exactly in this place, and based on this video we came to the conclusion that this pocket was taken by the Russians and secured. So we see that the situation remained tense for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, several pro-Ukrainian sources who has relations with the situation on the ground reported that the fields to the south of Yablunovka were already taken by the Russians. So Ukrainian source reported that most likely all these fields to the south of the village of Yablunovka were already taken by the Russians during the previous days' offensive operation. So this is the situation in this direction, and we see that we are coming to an end of the battle for the southern Konstantinivka direction, or for the Kliban-Bytsky pocket. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. If you remember, yesterday several sources reported that the Russians managed to enter the village of Koptiva. This information yesterday was provided by pro-Russian resources, and today we got additional confirmation. Neutral mappers also adjusted their maps in Russian favor, and according to them, the Russians established control for over 40 or 50% of this small village that is located to the northeast of the settlement of Novoekonomichna. Furthermore, today we got another video in the area of Malinovka. We will not watch this video due to violence and casualties. In this video we might see how Russian soldiers were moving along the dam in the southern direction. So now we see that the Russians are trying to continue their offensive operation in the direction of Novoekonomichna from the east, and the Russians are trying to outflank the settlement from the northeast. If the Russians are able to establish or to get as close as possible to the settlement of Novoekonomichna, this is going to be the beginning of complete disaster for the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration, because from these positions the Russians would be able to establish complete fire and FPV drone control over the main supply lines, and Ukrainians would be caught in cauldron by the Russians. Now let's talk about the Dnipro direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got lots of updates, and according to them, the Russians continue consolidation of their forces along the border between the settlements of Goryokhova and Novopavlovka. Today, several sources reported that the Russians secured this tree line and added additional territories under control, and today we got several geolocations to the south and to the southeast of the settlement of Goryokhova. Once again, there are also lots of casualties and violence in these videos, so that is why we are not going to watch them. Furthermore, this information of additional progress was confirmed by neutral mappers. So summarizing everything, we see that currently the Russians are trying to outflank the settlement of Goryokhova from the south and from the southeast, and the Russians are trying to outflank Ukrainian positions to the north of Alexeyevka. We're talking about this dense network of the fortifications. Anyway, we see that after the fall of the settlement of Alexeyevka, the Russians are trying to improve their positions, to maintain the lines, and to establish complete control over the entire border between Dnipro and Donetsk regions, and to take under control everything to the east of this red line. And this is exactly what the Russians are doing right now, and the Russians are showing pretty fast results. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southern part of the settlement of Kamar. Additional territories were taken. According to several mappers, the Russians by the morning of the 11th of June of 2025 have established control for over more than 25 and 30% of this settlement. Now let's talk about the Zaporizhia direction. During the previous 24 hours and during the previous night, we got very important videos and updates. First of all, we got confirmation that the Russians indeed managed to improve their positions around the village of Malinovka. As of the beginning of the 11th of June of 2025, we still haven't received anything that can confirm whether the Russians managed to answer the settlement or not. Obviously, we have just reports that the Russians managed to improve their positions around the village. And most likely the Russians are not going to give up. They're going to continue their offensive operation until they establish complete control over the settlements of Malinovka and over the next settlements on the same line, the village of Poltavka. Very interesting details are coming from the Orekhov direction. Today, pro-Russian resources, pro-Russian mappers adjusted their map, and we have very interesting changes. According to several very reliable pro-Russian resources, as a result of offensive operation, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to answer the former women prison to the south of Mala Takmachka. So according to several sources, currently the clashes are taking place for this area. If this information is correct, then this is going to be the beginning of complete disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement of Orekhov and Mala Takmachka. This stronghold is very important chain in Ukrainian defense, and if Ukraine loses this chain of defense, the entire village of Mala Takmachka could collapse automatically. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.